November rain, cold as knives, hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the gushy building's 48th floor, crackling and smearing the city's lights into a blur of watery streaks. Elena stood at the conference room door, her fingertips pinching the divorce agreement that still carried the residual warmth of the printer. The edge of the paper was thin and sharp, grazing her finger pad, and she didn't even notice the tiny cut until a bead of blood seeped out, a vivid red drop falling onto the corner of the agreement, like an inconspicuous seal. Elena. Ethan sat at the far end of the long table, the silver cufflinks on his suit sleeves glinting coldly under the light. He didn't even lift his head, his tone as calm as if he were reviewing an ordinary acquisition contract. Just sign it. He paused, then added, as if delivering a standard closing remark, "These 5 years have been good to you." The air conditioning in the conference room was blasting, but Elena only felt that those 4 words were colder than the rain outside the window. They settled into her heart without stirring any ripples, quietly freezing something inside her. The door swung open, and a jasmine-scented perfume wafted in before any voice was heard. Serena entered in a misty blue silk maxi dress, the hem brushing the threshold with a faint rustle. She walked straight to Ethan's side and sat down, her fingertips brushing the back of his hand as if it were nothing. From start to finish, she didn't glance directly at Elena, as if she were nothing more than an extraneous piece of furniture in the room. "Ethan," she said, flipping through the sample invitation in her hand, "Mom said we should have the engagement party at the Peninsula Crystal Ballroom. What do you think?" As she spoke, her gaze finally swept over Elena, and a faint, almost pitying smile curled at the corners of her lips. "Miss Elena, don't take it to heart. Ethan and I grew up together. These 5 years you've been married to him, to put it bluntly, you've taken care of him for a while. It must have been quite a strain." Elena's pen paused mid-stroke. She looked up, for the first time meeting Serena's eyes directly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it made the air in the entire conference room freeze for an instant. "You're right, it was taking care of him. I just didn't expect that the luggage I kept an eye on for you would grow so worn so quickly, now that it's in your hands." The smile froze on Serena's face. Ethan furrowed his brow slightly, as if about to speak, but no words came out. Elena had already lowered her head again, stroke by stroke, writing the 3 letters of Elena neatly and carefully, not a single flourish too many, nor a trace of insincerity. She pushed the agreement back, and the drop of blood at the corner of the paper had dried into a dark brown stain. Ethan took the agreement, glanced at the signature, and his brow furrowed slightly, as if surprised. "You figured it out that quickly?" Elena stood up, her fingertips brushing the hem of her trench coat, a beige coat she had worn for 3 years, the cuffs already frayed with tiny fuzz balls. She looked up, for the first and last time, meeting Ethan's eyes directly. These were eyes she had once believed held the stars, but now she saw them for what they were, nothing more than a stagnant pool reflecting nothing at all. The sound of rain outside the window suddenly grew louder, pounding against the glass like some kind of countdown. She didn't say another word. She turned around, her high heels clicking against the marble floor, one step after another, crisp and resolute. At the doorway, her steps paused for half a second, but she didn't look back. She only left behind a remark that was light yet heavy as a verdict. 5 years have been enough for me to see many things clearly. Thank you both. The elevator door slid shut. The mirrored walls reflected her face, pale, yet eerily calm. With a ding, the elevator began to descend. Her face crumbled in an instant, her back pressed against the cold metal wall, her knees giving way, tears spilling out without warning, splashing onto the copy of the agreement and blurring a small patch of dark ink. She bit down hard on her lower lip, refusing to let a single sob escape. In the 48 floors of descent, she poured 5 years of grievance, endurance, and cautiousness, inch by inch, into the coldness of the elevator walls. First floor. Ding. The doors opened. She wiped the water from her face, took a deep breath, stepped outside, and let the downpour drench her completely. The rain seeped through her hair and slid down her collar, icy cold. She tilted her face up, closed her eyes, and let the rain wash away the last traces of her dishevelment. When she opened them again, her eyes held no trace of tears, only a calm almost translucent, scoured clean by the rain. From today onward, there was no Mrs. Gu, only Elena. On the third day after the divorce, before dawn broke, Elena sat at the bank teller's counter. After verifying the information, the clerk snipped each card in two with a crisp click, click, like she was severing something intangible. Elena stared blankly as the cards lost their validity one by one, until only one old, frayed card remained, the one she'd opened back in college, with a balance of 173,000. It was money she had secretly saved by taking freelance jobs without Gu's knowledge, the only part of her life that the marriage hadn't swallowed up. One by one, she wiped down the jewelry boxes and designer handbags, then packed them into a cardboard box, placing only a note on top, "These aren't mine." Returning them all. The handwriting was as neat as when she signed her name on the marriage certificate 5 years ago, but this time, the pen tip didn't tremble at all. That evening, she dug out the old laptop buried at the very bottom of her wardrobe. A thin layer of dust had accumulated in the gaps between the keys, and when the screen flickered on, the fan let out an aged hum. Page after page of design sketches emerged, the folds of haute couture gowns, the fusion of Chinese frog buttons with minimalist tailoring, the series her mentor had once annotated as too ahead of its time. The edges of the paper had yellowed and curled, yet the pencil lines remained as sharp as ever. She remembered Ethan's words, "A designer? That's not really respectable. Just stay home and be at ease." Back then, she had believed him, taking those words as care and locking them away in the deepest drawer of her heart. Now, as she unrolled these drawings once more, her fingertips tracing the familiar lines, she suddenly understood that wasn't care, it was domestication. Outside the window, the rain had stopped at some point, and a sliver of cold moonlight squeezed through the gap in the curtains, falling upon the pages and faintly illuminating those lines that had slept for 5 years. Enough. The next morning, she dragged a suitcase and boarded a flight to Milan. No one saw her off. The name that had once been pinned to the top of her phone's contact list had been deleted without a trace, and even the chat history was gone. Outside the porthole, the city gradually shrank into a blur of scattered lights. She gazed at those lights and whispered softly, "Elena, from now on, no one can make choices for you." Milan's basement had no heating. In winter, every breath turned into a puff of white mist. By day, Elena made sample garments at a Chinese-owned clothing factory. By night, she continued sketching under the dim glow of a desk lamp. When her fingers grew stiff from the cold, she rubbed them together and kept drawing. A woman from Ningbo who worked at the factory initially brushed off this divorced newbie who knew nothing, until an urgent order hit a sizing snag, sending her into a frantic panic. Elena said nothing. She picked up a pen, made 3 adjustments to the original pattern, and transformed a cheap fast fashion dress into something with the elegant drape of haute couture. "Where did you learn that?" The shop owner's eyes widened. "I learned it in university," Elena said, stitching a button, her voice very soft. "I just let it go to waste for 5 years. After that, her salary tripled, and she began taking on more pattern making and design work. She often stayed wrapped in a blanket, sketching until dawn. The faint rustle of a needle passing through fabric and the scratching of a pencil across paper were the 2 sounds that accompanied her the longest during those days. 5 weeks after the divorce, Elena doubled over the sewing machine, dry heaving so hard she couldn't straighten up. Clutching the pregnancy test, she sat on the toilet lid, staring at those 2 lines, utterly still for a full 10 minutes. She threw the test stick into the trash, washed her face, and returned to the sewing machine to keep pushing the pedal. That afternoon, she ran through 4 of the cheapest private obstetric clinics in Milan, finally choosing the most inconspicuous one, and scheduled her first prenatal checkup on an installment payment plan. She told no one. Starting that day, she simply began heating an extra glass of milk for herself every night, moving her overtime from 2 in the morning to midnight. Amid the sound of stitches falling on fabric, a layer of tenderness settled in, unnoticed by anyone. The twin pregnancy hit her harder than a single one would have. She bit down on a towel through round after round of morning sickness, then dusted a thin layer of powder over her sallow complexion to hide her pallor and went to work at the factory as usual. She never thought of using the children to reclaim anything. She simply felt, since these two children had chosen her as their mother, she ought to give them a starting point in this world worthy of them. She tucked her long accumulated design sketches into a worn craft paper folder with frayed edges and went to knock on the door of a niche boutique. Her knuckles pressed against the cold wooden door, and only after 3 knocks did she muster the courage to push it open. The shopkeeper, a picky Italian middle-aged woman, flipped through the clothes casually at first, but her movements grew slower and slower. She finally stopped at a trench coat with frog buttons, her fingertips repeatedly tracing the layered dark pattern. In accented English, she asked Elena, "How many pieces are left in this collection?" "I'll take them all." That day, walking out of the boutique, the Milan sunlight was just right. Elena stood before the display window, gazing at the first piece of clothing she had ever designed, hanging in the most prominent spot. Suddenly, the phrase undignified came to mind, but she felt not a trace of anger, only a near-relieving bitterness, as if she had finally forgiven the girl who, back then, didn't dare to resist. 8 months after Elena left, Ethan and Serena's wedding took place as scheduled. Invitations were scattered across the entire business circle, the affair lavish to the point of ostentation. But just 2 months after the wedding, a severe funding gap emerged in the Southeast Asian real estate project managed by the Gushy Group. Ethan, overwhelmed, sat through a sleepless night of meetings. The finance director spread out the reports, pointed at a figure, and said, "Ethan, something's off with this gap. The special fund set aside 5 years ago for risk hedging, the account is virtually empty." Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose. Wasn't it always said to be in the process of being revitalized? The previous management reported it this way, but we pulled the original ledgers. The financial director hesitated, ultimately pushing forward a worn-out reconciliation statement. "This money has been siphoned off in batches since the signing 5 years ago. Each amount fell just below the audit threshold, spanning nearly a year. Whoever orchestrated this new financial regulations inside and out." Ethan flipped through the pages, his grip gradually tightening. 5 years ago, this project was signed by his father. By the time Ethan took over, 2 years had already passed. The report simply stated structured financing costs. He trusted the team around him, trusted the foundation his father had left, and never thought to request the original documents for a line-by-line verification. The price of that trust now lay before him. After Serena married into the Gu family, her temperament gradually revealed another side. Several questionable expenses quietly appeared on the procurement list, with no clear purpose explained. During a family banquet, a trivial dispute led her to openly clash with old Mrs. Gu, shattering a Celadon teacup that had been passed down for 3 generations. The old lady sighed privately. Elena was the sensible one. "It's only been this long, and my heart is feeling more unsettled by the day." Ethan would sit alone in his study late into the night, his finger gliding across his phone screen, stopping at an old photo he couldn't bring himself to delete, their 3rd wedding anniversary, a table of home-cooked dishes Elena had clumsily learned to make, a band-aid on her thumb, her eyes curved into a smile. He stared at that band-aid for a long time, suddenly unable to recall whether she had been hurting that day. What he didn't know was that the account holder of the embezzled special funds ultimately bore the surname Shin. In the 3rd year of the Jiwan brand, Elena suffered the harshest blow since starting her business. An Italian fabric supplier that had already agreed to an exclusive deal suddenly backed out the day before signing, instead handing the order to an older, more established studio with deeper pockets and a stronger background. The excuse was high-sounding, more confidence in the stability of a mature brand, but Elena later learned through the grapevine that the other party had privately found out she had thin backing and might not be able to hold on. That day, as she walked out of the fabric supplier's office building, Milan's early spring still carried a lingering chill. The wind rushed into her collar, making her shiver. She didn't head straight back to her place but sat for a long time on a bench at the street corner, watching the passers-by come and go. For the first time, she felt a bone-deep sense of helplessness. No matter how far she ran, those 4 words, "You're not good enough," always found a way to reappear in a new guise. That evening, she pulled out her account book and crunched the numbers repeatedly. She realized that if no new orders came in by month's end, there would be a shortfall for both rent and workers' wages. In the crib beside her, her twin children slept soundly, their breaths even and deep. The older one had just broken a fever, a cooling patch still plastered on his forehead. She gazed at their sleeping faces, bit her lower lip, and forced back the tears that welled in her eyes. Early the next morning, she put on her one and only decent blazer and visited 6 boutique stores, getting rejected 5 times. At the last one, the very first store that had been willing to take her sample pieces, the owner, noticing the exhaustion etched beneath her eyes and catching a glimpse of the twins' photo on her phone screen, paused for a moment. She then pulled out a batch of stagnant inventory fabric from the storage room and said, "Take it for now. You can settle the payment after you make sales." It's not easy for a woman to get this far, raising 2 kids all on her own. The batch of discounted fabric was later made into one of Jiwon's earliest and most iconic collections. Limited by the material, she was forced to simplify the cuts, which unexpectedly gave rise to the signature minimalist style that would define her brand. She often said later that the near-breaking point, the low that almost made her give up, was actually the true beginning of Jiwon. In the 3rd year of Milan Fashion Week, when the finale Phoenix gown graced the runway, the entire audience rose to their feet, applause surging like a tidal wave that lingered long after. After the show, an executive from a top domestic fashion group pushed through the crowd, his voice urgent, "Ms. Elena, we've been following Jiwon closely and hope to facilitate an in-depth collaboration to bring Jiwon into the Chinese market." Elena responded with a smile. That night, standing by the floor-to-ceiling window backstage, gazing out at the dazzling Milan nightscape, her phone lit up with a message from a familiar fashion editor back home. "Elena, that Southeast Asian project of the Gushi Group has been desperately seeking external investment lately. Are you coming back?" Elena turned off the screen. Spread across her desk was an acquisition progress report, a record of the deals she had chipped away at over the past 3 years, leveraging Jiwon's brand valuation as leverage. Xinhua International Investment, a company registered in the Cayman Islands and held through multiple layers of offshore funds, quietly held 34% of the equity in the Gushi Group's Southeast Asian project. She was using the empire she built to acquire her ex-husband's mess. "Return," she said softly. "And soon." 1 week before returning home, Elena's team closed the final link in the chain of evidence. 5 years ago, in the same month the Gushi Group signed the Southeast Asia project, a special fund of 80 million yuan began to flow out in batches, spanning 8 months, with each amount precisely controlled below the audit trigger line. The ultimate recipient was a private account under the surname Shin. The operational path was clear, the methods practiced, and the entire process lasted nearly a year. This was not a spur-of-the-moment embezzlement, but a long-planned infiltration. More critically, the team uncovered email archives from the previous management. The messages clearly documented that Serena's father, Mr. Shin, had privately contacted the fund custodian 3 months before the project signing. In other words, while Serena was still dating Ethan, the Shin family had already begun laying the groundwork to control the lifeline of the Gushi Group. And all of this was happening when Elena had been married into the Gu family for less than half a year, still clumsily learning to cook, sew on buttons, and gauge her mother-in-law's preferences. She closed the file and tapped the cover lightly with her fingertips twice. "Organize this into a complete chain of evidence, in triplicate. 1 copy for the media, 1 for the regulatory authorities, and 1 for our records." The Gushi Group's annual Strategic Cooperation Celebration Gala was held at the city's most prestigious riverside hotel. The Southeast Asia project had finally seen a turning point. Xinhua International Investment had extended an olive branch, and tonight was the day for the official signing. The chandeliers in the banquet hall glittered brilliantly. Ethan stood at the head of the table, but in just 3 years, gray hairs had already appeared at his temples. Serena, holding his arm, said with a tense tone, "Ethan, tonight has to go smoothly." Her fingertips clutched his sleeve, hard enough to wrinkle the fabric. 2 days ago, a former classmate from the legal department had privately warned her that a third-party organization was intensively reviewing the original financial records of the project from 5 years ago. That night, she had her family hastily produce several more complete explanatory notes to try to dress up the capital flow as a normal short-term loan, and even slipped red envelopes to a few veteran employees who knew the details. She thought she had filled in all the cracks. She didn't know that Elena held the most original, unvarnished bank transaction records, untouched by any supplementary explanations. Halfway through the banquet, the host suddenly stepped up to the podium. "Distinguished guests, please allow me to introduce tonight's special guest, Ms. Elena, founder of Genue International Investments." Ethan's wine glass froze midair. Serena's smile stiffened as she muttered to her assistant, "Genue International? The mysterious capital group that acquired 34% of our shares but never showed up? It's a woman?" The lights at the entrance of the banquet hall suddenly blazed to life. The doors swung open, and a figure clad in stark black and silver walked in against the light. Her heels struck the marble floor, each step crisp and unhurried. Her silhouette was cut sharp as a blade, her very presence dropping the temperature of the entire hall by 2 degrees. "That's the modified version of this year's return collection from G1." Someone in the crowd whispered in shock. "Is that her? The Elena from Milan?" Serena's head shot up, her pupils contracting sharply. That face, those eyes, though perfectly made up, her aura was like a completely different person, yet she recognized her in an instant. "Elena," she blurted out, her voice sharp. Ethan spun around abruptly, the liquid in his glass sloshing over onto his cuff. He stared intently at the woman in the doorway. 3 years had passed, and he had never imagined seeing her again like this. Elena walked through the stunned gazes on either side of the long table, heading straight to the head table. She stopped beside the seat marked VIP, removed her sunglasses, and smiled faintly at Ethan. "Ethan, long time no see." The banquet hall was so silent you could hear a pin drop. Someone knocked over a fork, the crisp sound echoing like a slap in the face. You're the person in charge of Genue International?" Ethan's voice tightened. To be precise, Elena gestured for her assistant to place the documents on the main table, nudging them slightly with her fingertips. "I am the founder, and I also hold 34% of your company's equity in the Southeast Asia project. In other words, tonight's contract cannot be signed without my approval." Muffled exclamations rippled through the audience below. Serena forced herself to stand, not even noticing that one of her nails had broken. "Where did you get so much money? Who did you latch onto?" A faint, sardonic smile flickered across Elena's lips as she raised her hand, signaling for the large screen behind her to light up. On the screen, the highlight reels of G1's 3 years rolled by, the standing ovation at the finale of Fashion Week, international buying directors scrambling to sign contracts, the brand's valuation curve climbing steeply upward, ending with a freeze frame of Elena's silhouette standing on the rooftop of the Milan headquarters. After half a minute of silence, she spoke calmly, "Miss Serena, I built this over 3 years with my own hands, and with things you once scoffed at." Ethan took a step forward. "Elena, we can discuss the collaboration in private." "Mr. Ethan, there's no need to rush." Elena cut him off, signaling her assistant to bring up another document. "There is one more thing I must make clear in front of all the shareholders and the media." On the screen appeared the most original bank transaction records. 5 years ago, in the month your project was signed, a special fund of 80 million began to flow out in batches, lasting 8 months, with each amount kept just below the audit threshold. The final destination. She pressed the remote, and the screen displayed a private account's transaction history. The account holder column clearly read Shin. Miss Serena's family account. The trail is clear, spanning nearly a year. This wasn't a temporary diversion, it was premeditated. And the Shin family's contact with the fund custodian began 3 months before the Gushy Group signed the contract. Serena's face instantly drained of all color. "That's impossible, it's forged." Whether it's forged or not, you know the truth, Elena said calmly, delivering the second blow. As for that explanation you hastily put together overnight, along with the special favors you gave to a few senior employees, my team has kept records of those as well. Falsifying evidence and obstructing an investigation is another matter entirely. Serena collapsed back into her chair, her makeup smearing into a mess. She grabbed Ethan's arm. Ethan, I did it for my parents. I thought I could cover it up. I never imagined it would snowball out of control. Ethan violently shook off her hand, his chest heaving. He stared at her with a fury in his eyes unlike anything he had ever shown before. 3 years. You made me, time after time, stand in front of her and call it a planning mistake. You were even lying to me just these past 2 days. That money, you had already started moving it before you married me. The security guard stepped forward to escort the crying and struggling Serena out of the venue. Her screams echoed down the hallway, gradually fading away. Ethan turned around, his eyes rimmed with red, his voice hoarse. Elena, thank you for uncovering the truth and saving the company. Can we talk privately? Elena looked at him, her gaze devoid of hatred, holding only a kind of unfamiliar calm. Mr. Ethan, my team will handle the collaboration matters. As for we, before she could finish, footsteps sounded from the side entrance of the banquet hall. 2 children, about 4 years old, dressed in a little suit and a little dress, ran in holding hands, followed by a panting nanny. Mommy. The 2 children threw themselves into Elena's arms. Ethan felt as if struck by lightning. He stared intently at the 2 faces, those eyes were almost a mirror image of his own. These are ours? His voice trembled, the words barely forming a sentence. When you left 3 years ago, you were already. Elena gently stroked the children's hair. I was 2 months pregnant when I left. I didn't tell anyone, because I didn't want people to think I was staying in the Gu family only for the sake of the children. These past 3 years, they've been just fine, so fine that they don't need a father who was never there. Ethan stumbled back a step, his eyes rimmed with red. Give me a chance to make it up to you. Let's start over, okay? Elena crouched down to soothe the 2 children, then gestured for the nanny to take them to the lounge. Only then did she stand up again. Outside the window, lanterns flickered one by one along the river, their reflections shimmering on the floor-to-ceiling glass like a scattering of broken stars. Ethan, that I appreciate your hard work from 3 years ago, it took me an entire night to figure out. It turns out that all my efforts over those 5 years were nothing more than an employment arrangement in your eyes, something that could be settled with a token of gratitude. She paused. These past 3 years, I've sewn sample garments through the night in a basement with no heating, and I signed surgical consent forms alone in a foreign delivery room. I don't hate you. Hating someone takes too much energy. I've saved all my energy for myself these 3 years. Ethan's lips trembled as he pulled a worn document with frayed edges from the inner pocket of his suit. It was the divorce agreement from 3 years ago. The drop of bloodstain was still there at the corner of the page, a dark brown, like a wound that would never heal. I've kept it all this time. His voice was barely audible. Elena looked down at the agreement, her gaze pausing for a moment on that drop of bloodstain. Then she reached out, took the agreement, and in front of Ethan, tore it into pieces, shred by shred. The paper scraps fell onto the carpet like a silent snow. What you kept was the blood I shed. What I kept is the ground I stand on now. We're even. She turned, picked up her handbag, and walked away with a composed stride, without a trace of lingering attachment. Ethan stared blankly at her retreating figure, unable to utter a single word of entreaty. Outside the banquet hall, the night wind was chilly. Elena slowed down as she walked through the hotel lobby. Beyond the glass doors, the nanny was holding the hands of 2 children, waiting by the fountain for the car. The younger one stood on tiptoe, chasing a firefly, while the older one looked up, counting stars. She pushed open the door and stepped outside. The 2 children turned, saw her, and rushed over with joyful shouts. She crouched down, wrapping an arm around each of them, and lifted her gaze to the vast starry sky. A serene smile slowly spread across her lips. After the celebration, the scandal of the Shin family misappropriating special funds and fabricating evidence to obstruct the investigation was widely reported by the media. Regulatory authorities stepped in, and Serena, along with her family, was formally charged with several offenses, including embezzlement and evidence tampering. Within a month, their once flourishing empire crumbled to dust. Meanwhile, Elena's legendary experiences were widely reported by major media outlets, from the former Mrs. Gu who was cast out to the fashion queen who returned from Milan. Although the Gushy Group managed to salvage the project, its stock price took a significant downturn. Ethan would often sit alone in the empty study, staring at the photo of his 2 children on the desk. Elena had her assistant deliver it when she left, with a line written on the back, "They are fine, and they don't need guilt, only occasional genuine care. As for what's between you and me, let it be the past." Ethan tucked the photo into the deepest drawer, closed his eyes, and let out a long sigh. He finally understood that some losses could never be redeemed, no matter how much regret he carried for the rest of his life. At the top floor of the Milan headquarters, Elena stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows. The snowline of the Alps outside shimmered with a pale golden light under the sunset. Spread across her desk was a copy of the Wall Street Journal, the headline reading, "From Seamstress to Fashion Queen, the 10 Years of Elena." She reached up and removed the earrings, the only piece of jewelry she had taken with her after the divorce, not worth much, bought with her own money. She placed the earrings into the drawer and closed it. Outside the window, the snowlight was perfect. 6 months later, the first domestic flagship store of Jiwon held its grand opening. Elena, dressed in a cream-white suit, had 2 children beside her, both wearing matching little trench coats, holding the hem of her skirt from either side. The reporter asked, "If you were given another chance to go back to the past, would you regret the choice you made back then?" Elena crouched down, gently embracing her 2 children, her gaze tender yet resolute. "No. That experience taught me that a woman's true worth never depends on who she marries, but on whether she can live her own light. If you're not cherished, then bravely turn around. The stars and seas that truly belong to you never need you to look back for the approval of the past." The sunlight poured down, casting a brilliant gleam on the golden signboard of Jiwon. Elena took her children's hands, turned around, and walked into the store without looking back. Years later, Jiwon grew into a world-renowned top-tier fashion brand, and Elena's name had transformed from Mrs. Gu into a legend praised throughout the business and fashion circles. She always remembered that rainy night, the icy chill of raindrops sliding along her hair into her collar, the hard coldness of the elevator wall pressing against her back. That was the lowest point in her life, yet it was also where she began to rediscover herself. Outside the window, the sunlight was just right, and time stood still. The girl who once wept in the rain had long since become the brightest light in her own heart.